Release the K9. The command cuts through the air as Rex lunges forward, then suddenly stops, inches from the old veteran's chest. Silence crashes over the scene. The officer shouts again, louder this time, but the dog doesn't move. Instead, Rex lowers his head, tail still, eyes locked on the man like he's seeing something no one else can. The veteran doesn't flinch. He just whispers, "Easy, you remember." The dog lets out a soft whine and steps closer, pressing against him instead of attacking. The crowd freezes. The officers hesitate, because in that moment, the only one who knew the truth was the dog. Sometimes, the ones trained to obey are the first to recognize the truth. The command came sharp and final, cutting through the cold morning air like a line drawn in stone. Release the K9. Officer Daniel Hayes stood with his arm extended, fingers rigid, eyes locked on the figure ahead. Around him, the quiet suburban street had transformed into something unrecognizable. Patrol cars angled across driveways, red and blue lights washing over white picket fences, neighbors watching from behind curtains they barely dared to move. At the center of it all stood an old man. William Carter didn't look dangerous. He stood still on the cracked concrete of his front walkway, shoulders slightly hunched beneath a faded brown jacket, gray hair catching the pale sunlight like frost on dry grass. His hands hung loosely at his sides, not raised, not hidden, just there, as if he had already decided there was nothing left to prove. The wind moved softly through the trees, carrying the faint scent of fallen leaves and distant rain, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Beside Officer Hayes, the German shepherd tensed. Rex was built like precision, muscles coiled beneath a sleek coat of black and tan, ears sharp, eyes focused with the kind of discipline only years of training could carve into a living creature. He had never hesitated before. Not once. His breathing slowed, steady and controlled, as if he were listening to something deeper than the command itself. Hayes gave the signal again, firmer this time, his voice edged with urgency. Go. The leash snapped free. Rex surged forward, paws striking the pavement with quiet power, closing the distance in seconds. But as he neared the old man, something shifted. Not in the air, not in the sound. Something quieter, something older. Rex slowed. One step, then another. His ears flicked, not in confusion, but in focus, as if the world had suddenly begun speaking in a language only he could hear. The officers behind Hayes exchanged glances, tension tightening across their faces. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. The dog was supposed to follow through. The dog always followed through. But Rex didn't lunge. He didn't bark. Instead, he stopped just inches away from William Carter, his body still, his gaze lifted toward the man's face. The old veteran didn't move. Not even an inch. His eyes, a quiet gray that had seen too many years pass too quickly, softened as they met the dog's. Then, almost too softly to hear, he spoke. Easy, boy. The words didn't carry authority. They carried memory. Rex's tail lowered. Not in fear. In recognition. He took a slow step forward, nose lifting, drawing in the scent of the man. Dust, old fabric, something faintly metallic, and beneath it all, something familiar. Something that didn't belong to this street, or this moment, or this misunderstanding. Something that belonged to another time. The radio at Hayes's shoulder crackled, breaking the silence. But even that sound seemed distant now. Because right there, in the space between command and action, the dog made a choice. And no one, not the officers, not the watching neighbors, not even the man standing still in the center of it all, yet understood why. The stillness did not break all at once. It unraveled slowly, like frost melting under a quiet sun. Rex remained inches from William Carter, his nose hovering near the man's hand, drawing in each detail as if piecing together something long forgotten. His breathing changed first, no longer the controlled rhythm of a trained unit, but something softer, deeper, almost uncertain. Officer Hayes felt it before he understood it. The tension in the leash that was no longer there, the absence of motion where there should have been decisive action. Around him, radios whispered, boots shifted against pavement, but no one stepped forward. No one interrupted what they could not yet explain. William did not move. The years had taught him that sometimes the strongest thing a man could do was remain still. His fingers, worn and lined with time, twitched slightly as the dog's breath brushed against his skin. There was no fear in his eyes, only a quiet recognition, as if he had been here before in some other place, under a different sky, when the air carried dust instead of autumn leaves. "You feel it too, do you not?" he murmured, barely above a breath. Rex's ears tilted forward, catching the cadence more than the words. The tone mattered. It always had. The dog took another step closer, slow enough that it seemed like time itself had softened to allow it. His head lowered, not in submission, but in thought, in something that resembled memory trying to surface through layers of training and command. Behind them, Hayes swallowed hard, his jaw tightening. "Rex," he called, his voice firm but no longer certain. "Return." The word hung in the air, clear, practiced, meant to trigger instinct. But Rex did not respond. Not because he refused, but because something else had taken precedence. Something older than commands. Something deeper than drills. The wind shifted slightly, brushing past the houses, rattling a loose gutter somewhere down the street. A child's bicycle lay tipped over on a lawn, forgotten in the sudden disruption of ordinary life. And in that fragile space between order and confusion, the dog made his choice clearer. Rex lowered himself further, his posture easing, muscles unwinding one fraction at a time until the tension that defined him seemed to dissolve. His tail moved once, slow and deliberate, not wagging in excitement, but acknowledging presence. Then, with a quiet certainty that no one had trained into him, he pressed the side of his head gently against William's hand. A sound escaped him, soft, almost like a question answered. The officers exchanged looks now, unease spreading in a way no shouted command ever could. This was not defiance. This was something else entirely. Hayes stepped forward cautiously, his boots scraping lightly against the concrete. "Sir," he said, voice measured, trying to regain control of a moment that had slipped beyond protocol. "I need you to step away from the dog." William did not look at him. His attention remained on Rex, his fingers slowly, carefully resting against the dog's fur. Not gripping, not claiming, just there. "He already knows," William said quietly. Hayes frowned. "Knows what?" For a moment, the old man said nothing. The silence stretched, filled only by the distant hum of an idling engine and the faint rustle of leaves overhead. Then, William exhaled, a long, steady breath that seemed to carry years within it. "The difference," he said, "between a threat and a memory." The words settled over the scene in a way that made no immediate sense, yet no one dismissed them. Rex shifted slightly, his nose brushing against William's sleeve, lingering there as if tracing something invisible woven into the fabric. His eyes, sharp and intelligent, softened in a way Hayes had never seen before. Not during training, not during operations. This was not the look of a dog awaiting orders. This was the look of a dog remembering something he could not name. Hayes glanced back at the other officers, uncertainty flickering across his face. Procedure did not account for this. There was no line in the manual for a moment when instinct overruled command in such a quiet, undeniable way. "Rex," he tried again, softer now. "Heel." This time, the dog's ear flicked. A sign he had heard. A sign he understood. But still, he did not move away. Instead, he remained where he was, anchored not by the man, but by something within himself. William's thumb brushed lightly along the side of Rex's neck, finding a spot as if by habit, a place where tension eased almost instantly. The dog let out a low breath, his body settling further, trust unfolding in layers no one else could see. "It is all right," William whispered, not to the officers, not even entirely to the dog, but to something shared between them. The kind of understanding that does not need explanation. Hayes felt a shift then, not in the situation, but in himself. A hesitation. A question forming where certainty had been. He studied the man more closely now, noticing details he had overlooked before. The way William stood. The way his shoulders held a certain balance. The calm that did not come from ignorance, but from experience. And then there were the words. "Easy boy," not said like a stranger. Said like someone who had spent years speaking to animals that listened not just with ears, but with instinct. "Sir," Hayes said again, slower this time. "Have you worked with dogs before?" William's lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, but something close. His eyes remained on Rex as he answered. "Long enough," he said. The answer was simple, but it carried weight. Enough to make Hayes pause. Enough to make the officers behind him lower their guard just a fraction. Enough to make the moment stretch further, deeper, into something no longer defined by the initial call that brought them there. Rex shifted once more, then slowly, deliberately, he sat down beside William Carter, his body aligned with the man's leg as if he had chosen a place he intended to stay. Not guarding, not restraining, simply present. And in that quiet alignment, something unspoken settled into the space around them. Not resolution, not yet, but the beginning of a truth that had not fully surfaced, waiting just beneath the surface, like something the dog had already found, and the rest of them were only beginning to see. There was a moment, quiet and almost invisible, when the weight of authority began to loosen its grip on the scene. It did not happen with a command or a decision. It happened in the way people started to look again, not at the situation, but at the man standing in the center of it. Officer Hayes lowered his hand slowly, the gesture subtle but unmistakable, as if even he could feel that pushing forward now would break something that needed to unfold on its own. The radio at his shoulder crackled again, a distant voice asking for an update, but he did not answer right away. His attention remained fixed on William Carter and the dog who had chosen to sit beside him instead of carrying out the order. Rex's breathing had settled into a calm rhythm, his chest rising and falling steadily, his ears relaxed but still alert, tuned not to commands but to the man beside him. It was the kind of stillness that did not come from training. It came from trust. William shifted his weight slightly, the movement slow and deliberate, careful not to startle the dog, even though there was no sign that Rex would react with anything but quiet acceptance. His hand remained resting against the dog's neck, fingers barely moving, tracing a path that seemed guided more by memory than by intention. "You were taught well," William said softly, his voice carrying just enough to reach the officers without losing its calm. Hayes stepped a little closer, his boots making a faint sound against the concrete, but he stopped several feet away, as if crossing any further would intrude on something he did not yet understand. "Sir," he said, more measured now, "we received a report. They said you might be unstable." The word felt wrong even as he spoke it, as if it did not belong in the presence of the man he was now observing. William let out a quiet breath that might have been a faint laugh, though there was no bitterness in it. "Unstable," he repeated, as if testing the weight of the word. "That depends on who is doing the measuring." A faint murmur moved through the gathered officers, the tension shifting from alertness to something closer to uncertainty. Hayes studied him more carefully now, noticing details that had been invisible before. The way his stance was balanced, not defensive, not aggressive, just steady. The way his eyes moved, not scanning for exits, but observing, aware, present. And then there was the way he spoke to the dog, not as if it were a tool, but as if it were a partner. "We just need to make sure everyone is safe," Hayes said, though his voice had softened almost without his permission. William nodded once, a small, respectful gesture. "So do I," he replied. The words hung in the air, simple but layered with something deeper, something that made Hayes pause again. Behind him, one of the younger officers shifted, glancing between Hayes and the scene unfolding in front of them. "Sir," the officer said quietly. The caller mentioned something about a weapon. The word rippled through the moment, bringing with it a shadow of the urgency that had started it all. Hayes turned his gaze back to William, searching now, not for compliance, but for understanding. "Do you have anything on you we should know about?" he asked. William did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked down at Rex, his hand still resting gently against the dog's fur. The dog's eyes met his, and for a brief moment, something passed between them again, silent and unspoken. Then William slowly lifted his free hand, not high, not in surrender, but enough to show that it was empty. "Only what I have always carried," he said. The answer was not what Hayes expected, but it did not feel like a deflection. It felt like a truth that required context. "And what is that?" Hayes asked, his voice quieter now. William's gaze shifted toward him, steady and clear. "Memory," he said. The words settled into the space between them, and for a moment, no one spoke. The wind moved again, carrying a faint chill that brushed against their skin, reminding them that time was still passing even as the moment seemed suspended. Rex shifted slightly, pressing closer to William's leg, his presence grounded and unwavering. Hayes exhaled slowly, a decision forming not from protocol, but from instinct. "All right," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. "Let us try this a different way." He took another step forward, this time not as an officer closing in, but as a man trying to understand. "Mr. Carter," he said, using the name more deliberately now, "can you tell me what happened this morning?" William looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing not the question, but the person asking it. Then he nodded slightly. "Someone saw something they did not recognize," he said. "And when people do not recognize something, they often fear it." Hayes frowned slightly. "What did they see?" William's eyes moved briefly toward the small house behind him, its paint weathered but cared for, the front window catching the soft light of the morning. "They saw me digging," he said. "In the yard." Hayes blinked, the tension in his shoulders easing just a fraction. "Digging," he repeated. William nodded again. "Yes," he said, "trying to find something I buried a long time ago." The answer was simple, but it carried a weight that made the air feel heavier, not with danger, but with meaning. Hayes glanced at the patch of ground near the walkway, noticing now the disturbed soil, the shovel leaning against the fence, details that had been overlooked in the rush of response. "What were you looking for?" he asked. William's hand moved once more along Rex's neck, the gesture steady, grounding, as if drawing strength from the contact. "Not what?" he said quietly. "Who?" The word landed differently this time, deeper, pulling something unseen into the light. Rex's ears flicked again, his body still calm, but his attention sharpened, as if he understood the shift before anyone else did. Hayes felt it too, a subtle change in the air, a sense that the situation they thought they had arrived at was not the one they were actually standing in. "Who?" he asked again, softer now. William's gaze drifted past. Him, not unfocused, but distant, as if looking through layers of time rather than space. "A partner," he said. And in that moment, something in Rex stirred again, not with tension, not with uncertainty, but with recognition that had not yet fully revealed itself, waiting just beneath the surface, as if the truth was not something that needed to be found, but something that had been waiting all along for the right moment to be remembered. The word lingered in the air longer than any command that had been spoken that morning. Partner. It did not carry urgency, but it carried weight, the kind that settled slowly into the bones of those listening. Officer Hayes felt it first as a shift in his chest, a quiet tightening that had nothing to do with protocol and everything to do with something deeper, something human. He glanced briefly at the disturbed patch of earth again, then back at William Carter, and for the first time since arriving, he was no longer looking for a threat. He was looking for a story. "A partner," Hayes repeated, his voice lower now, as if raising it might disturb something fragile. "You mean someone you worked with?" William did not answer right away. His eyes remained distant for a moment, not lost, but traveling somewhere the rest of them could not follow. Rex remained pressed gently against his side, the dog's presence steady, grounding, as if he too sensed that whatever came next required stillness. The wind softened, brushing lightly through the trees, carrying with it the faint scent of damp soil and something older, something buried beneath seasons of quiet. "He was not just someone I worked with," William said at last. "He was the reason I made it home." The words were simple, but they changed the shape of the moment entirely. Hayes felt his posture shift again, the rigid line of authority easing into something more open, more attentive. Behind him, one of the officers lowered his radio slightly, the crackling voice fading into the background as the weight of the conversation took precedence. "Was he military?" Hayes asked. William nodded once. "K-9 unit," he said. "Search and rescue. Detection. Loyalty you could not measure." His hand moved slightly along Rex's neck as he spoke, the gesture instinctive, as if the memory lived not just in his mind, but in his muscles, in the way he touched, in the way he stood. Rex's ears flicked again at the tone, not the words, and his body leaned just a fraction closer, as if drawn by something familiar in the cadence of William's voice. "What was his name?" Hayes asked quietly. William's gaze dropped to the ground near the disturbed soil, his expression softening in a way that carried both warmth and something like loss. "Eli," he said. The name settled into the air with a quiet finality, as if it had been waiting a long time to be spoken again. Rex shifted at the sound, his head tilting slightly, his eyes narrowing in a way that suggested recognition not fully formed, like a memory trying to surface through layers of time and training. Hayes noticed it this time. He noticed the way the dog reacted not to commands, but to the story itself. "You said you were digging," Hayes continued, carefully now. "You think he is here?" William exhaled slowly, the breath steady, controlled. "I know he is," he said. The certainty in his voice did not come from stubbornness. It came from something quieter, something earned. Hayes glanced again at the patch of earth, the shovel resting against the fence, the small mound of displaced soil. It did not look like much. But then again, most things that mattered rarely did at first glance. "How long ago?" Hayes asked. William's eyes lifted slightly, not to Hayes, but to the sky above the rooftops, pale and clear in the late morning light. 32 years, he said. The number carried a weight of time that pressed gently against the moment, stretching it beyond the present, connecting it to something far older. A murmur moved through the officers again, quieter this time, less about uncertainty and more about understanding. 32 years was not just time. It was a lifetime of holding on to something. "You buried him here?" Hayes asked. William nodded. "He brought me back," he said. "I brought him home." Rex let out a soft breath, almost a sigh, his body relaxing further, his head lowering slightly, as if the words themselves had settled something inside him. Hayes felt it again. That shift, that sense that the situation had transformed into something else entirely, something that required not control, but respect. "Why now?" Hayes asked gently. "Why dig him up after all this?" "Time." William's hand stilled for a moment against Rex's fur, his fingers resting lightly as he considered the question. The wind moved again, a little stronger this time, rustling the leaves, carrying with it the faintest sound of something loose tapping against metal somewhere down the street. "Because I heard him," William said. Hayes frowned slightly. "Heard him?" William nodded, his expression calm, not defensive, not uncertain. "Not like a voice," he said. "More like a pull, like something unfinished." The explanation did not fit neatly into any report Hayes had ever filed, but it did not feel dismissible either. It felt like something that belonged to a different kind of truth, one that did not rely on evidence, but on connection. Rex shifted again, his nose lowering toward the ground near William's feet, sniffing lightly, tracing the scent of the disturbed soil. His body stilled after a moment, his ears lifting, his focus narrowing, as if something beneath the surface had caught his attention in a way no command ever had. Hayes noticed that too. "Rex," he said softly, not as an order, but as an invitation. The dog did not look back. His attention remained on the ground, on the place where the earth had been opened. Slowly, deliberately, Rex stood, taking a few steps forward, his movements careful, precise, guided by instinct rather than instruction. He lowered his nose to the edge of the dug area, inhaling deeply, then paused. The stillness that followed felt different from before. It was no longer uncertainty. It was recognition waiting to be confirmed. William watched him closely, his expression unreadable to anyone but the dog. "Go on," he whispered, barely audible. Rex shifted his weight, then gently pressed one paw against the loose soil, not digging, not disrupting, just touching, as if acknowledging something beneath. Then he looked back at William, his eyes bright, alert, carrying a question that did not need words. And in that quiet exchange, something unseen began to surface, not yet revealed, but undeniable in its presence, as if the truth had been waiting beneath the earth all along, and now, guided by instinct and memory, it was finally ready to be found. The air seemed to hold its shape as Rex's paw rested gently against the loosened earth, as if even the ground itself understood that something long buried was about to be acknowledged again. No one spoke. Even the radios had gone quiet now, either turned down or forgotten, as every set of eyes fixed on the same small patch of soil that had suddenly become the center of something far larger than a routine call. William Carter watched the dog with a stillness that did not come from hesitation, but from trust, the kind that is built over years and never truly fades, even when time tries to cover it. Rex's nose hovered just above the dirt, drawing in slow, deliberate breaths, each one deeper than the last, as if searching for a scent that did not belong to the present. His body stiffened for a brief moment, not in alarm, but in recognition that had finally found its mark. His ears lifted, his tail held steady, and then he exhaled softly, a sound so subtle it might have been missed if not for the silence surrounding it. William nodded, almost imperceptibly, as if the dog had just confirmed something he had already known. "That is him," William said quietly, his voice carrying a calm certainty that did not ask for agreement. Officer Hayes felt a slow shift inside himself, something that had started as doubt now giving way to something closer to understanding, though he could not yet explain why. He stepped closer, careful with each movement, as if approaching a place that required respect rather than authority. "Rex found something?" Hayes asked, though the question felt unnecessary even as he spoke it. William did not look at him. His gaze remained on the ground, on the place where memory and time had quietly intersected. "He did not find it," William said. "He remembered it." The words settled deeper than anything said before, drawing a line between instinct and something far more profound. Hayes glanced at the other officers, seeing in their faces the same uncertainty he felt, but also something new, something softer. No one reached for restraint. No one moved to interrupt. For the first time since arriving, they were not reacting. They were witnessing. Rex shifted his weight slightly, then lowered himself to the ground beside the disturbed soil, his front legs folding beneath him in a posture that was neither trained nor commanded. It was chosen. His head rested just inches from the earth, his eyes focused, steady, as if guarding something unseen. William took a slow step forward, his boots pressing lightly into the soft dirt, closing the distance between himself and the place he had been digging. The movement was careful, measured, not because he feared disturbing the ground, but because he understood what it held. The past was not something to be rushed. It was something to be approached with patience. Hayes followed a few steps behind, maintaining a respectful distance, his attention fixed not on control, but on comprehension. "What do you think is down there?" he asked quietly. William reached for the shovel leaning against the fence, his hand wrapping around the worn handle with familiarity that came not from habit, but from intention. He did not lift it right away. Instead, he rested it lightly against the ground, as if asking permission from something beneath. "Not what?" William repeated softly. "Who?" Rex's ears flicked again at the tone, and he lifted his head slightly, watching William with a focus that bordered on reverence. The connection between them was no longer subtle. It was visible, undeniable, woven into every small movement they made. Hayes noticed it now in full, the way the dog mirrored the man, the way the man trusted the dog, the way neither seemed to question what the other understood. It was not training. It was something deeper, something that had been built long before this morning, long before this street, long before any of them had stepped into this moment. William pressed the shovel into the earth with a steady motion, the metal edge slipping into the softened soil without resistance. The sound was quiet, almost gentle, a low scrape that seemed to echo more in memory than in air. He lifted a small amount of dirt, setting it aside carefully, not tossing it, not rushing, each movement deliberate, respectful. Rex remained still, his eyes following every motion, his body calm but attentive, as if guiding the process without needing to move. Hayes watched closely, his mind trying to reconcile what he was seeing with everything he had been trained to expect. This was not procedure. This was something else entirely. Another layer of soil came up, then another, each one revealing nothing and yet revealing everything, because the act itself was no longer about discovery. It was about return. The wind shifted again, carrying a slightly cooler breeze, brushing across the open ground, stirring the loose dirt just enough to remind them that time was still moving forward, even as they reached back into something long past. William paused after a few moments, resting the shovel upright, his breath steady but deeper now. He looked down at the ground, then at Rex, as if confirming once more that they were exactly where they needed to be. Rex met his gaze, his tail giving a single, slow movement, not in excitement, but in quiet affirmation. Hayes felt it again, that subtle pull, that sense that what they were witnessing was not coincidence, but alignment. "You said he brought you home," Hayes said softly. "What happened?" William's eyes remained on the ground, but his voice carried the weight of something long held. "We were out there longer than we should have been," he said. "Conditions changed. Things do not always go the way they are planned." He paused, his hand tightening slightly on the handle of the shovel, not in tension, but in memory. He found the way back, he continued. When I could not. The words were simple, but they carried a depth that needed no elaboration. Hayes nodded slowly, understanding more in what was not said than what was. Rex shifted again, his nose lowering once more toward the ground, his breathing deepening as if the scent beneath the surface was becoming clearer, stronger, undeniable now. William leaned forward slightly, his hand reaching down to touch the soil, his fingers brushing against it with a care that mirrored the way he had touched the dog. "We are close," he said quietly. And in that moment, the space around them seemed to narrow, not in pressure, but in focus, as if everything that had led to this point was now converging on what lay just beneath the surface, waiting, patient, for the moment it would finally be seen again. The moment did not arrive with a sudden revelation, but with a quiet shift so subtle it almost went unnoticed, like the way dawn replaces darkness without ever announcing itself. William Carter knelt slowly, the years in his joints evident in the careful way he lowered himself toward the earth, but there was no hesitation in the motion, only purpose. His fingers pressed gently into the loosened soil, brushing aside the top layer not with urgency, but with reverence, as if each grain carried a memory he refused to disturb. Too quickly. Rex remained close, his body angled toward the ground, his breathing steady but deeper now, every inhale drawing in something that belonged not to the present, but to a time long past. Officer Hayes stood just behind them, no longer the center of authority, but a witness to something unfolding beyond his training, beyond his understanding, yet impossible to ignore. The other officers had fallen into a quiet formation, their presence no longer imposing, but protective in a different way, as if they too sensed that what lay beneath the surface was not a threat, but something that deserved to be brought back into the light with care. William paused for a moment, his hand resting against the soil, his eyes closed briefly as if listening, not with his ears, but with something deeper. The wind softened again, carrying with it the faint rustle of leaves and the distant hum of a world continuing on beyond this small, suspended space. Then, with a steady breath, he resumed, clearing away another layer of earth, revealing soil that was darker, more compact, untouched for decades. Rex shifted slightly, his nose lowering closer, his body still but alert, as if he could feel the boundary between now and then, between what was seen and what was remembered. A faint metallic sound broke the silence, soft but distinct, as William's fingers brushed against something beneath the soil. He stopped immediately, his hand hovering for a fraction of a second before gently clearing the surrounding dirt with more precision, more care. The officers leaned in slightly, not stepping forward, but drawn by the quiet significance of the moment. Hayes felt his breath slow, matching the rhythm of the scene, as if even his body understood that rushing now would be a kind of disrespect. Slowly, the shape beneath the soil began to take form, not fully revealed, but enough to suggest something deliberate, something placed there with intention rather than forgotten by time. William's hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but from recognition, the kind that comes when something long carried inside finally meets the world again. "You stayed," he whispered, the words barely audible, yet heavy with meaning. Rex let out a soft sound, somewhere between a breath and a low hum, his head lowering further until it nearly touched the ground, his eyes fixed on the place where William's hand moved. With careful precision, Hayes felt a quiet shift inside his chest, something loosening, something opening, as if the scene in front of him was rewriting the way he understood the moment entirely. This was no longer a call to respond to. This was a story returning to its origin. William continued to clear the soil, revealing more of the object beneath, the edges becoming clearer, the presence undeniable now. It was not large, but it carried weight beyond its size, the kind of weight that came from time, from memory, from the bond between a man and something that had once stood beside him when the world had been far less certain. Rex's tail moved once, slow and deliberate, his body leaning slightly closer, his nose hovering just above the exposed surface, drawing in the scent with a depth that suggested recognition beyond instinct. Hayes noticed the way the dog's posture had changed again, not tense, not uncertain, but grounded, as if he had found something that aligned with his very nature. He knows, Hayes said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. William nodded, his eyes never leaving the ground. He always did, he replied. The final layer of soil gave way under William's careful touch, revealing what had been hidden for more than 3 decades, not as something lost, but as something preserved, waiting. William's hand rested against it for a moment, not lifting, not uncovering it fully, just touching, reconnecting, as if acknowledging that some things do not belong to the past alone, but continue to exist in the quiet spaces between memory and presence. Rex lowered himself completely now, his body settled beside the uncovered place, his head resting gently near it, his eyes soft, steady, as if standing guard over something sacred. The officers remained silent, their earlier tension replaced by a quiet respect that required no instruction. Hayes exhaled slowly, the sound almost imperceptible, as he realized that whatever had brought them here was no longer the point. The point was what had been found, and the way it had been found, guided not by suspicion or force, but by something far more enduring. William finally lifted his gaze, not to the officers, not to the surroundings, but to Rex, his expression calm, grateful, and something more, something that spoke of a bond that time had not broken, only buried. "Thank you," he said softly. Rex's ear flicked at the sound, his tail giving one small movement, as if the words had reached him in a way no command ever could. And in that quiet exchange, the moment settled into something complete, not because everything had been revealed, but because what mattered most had already been understood. The world did not rush back in all at once. It returned slowly, like sound after a long snowfall, quiet at first, then layering itself back into place. The faint hum of engines, the distant creak of a porch swing somewhere down the street, the soft shifting of boots on pavement. But none of it disturbed what had settled at the center of the yard. William Carter remained kneeling, his hands still resting gently on what had been uncovered, his fingers unmoving now, as if even the slightest motion might break the fragile thread connecting past and present. Rex stayed beside him, his body grounded, his head lowered close to the earth, his eyes no longer searching but holding, as if the need to understand had been replaced by the simple act of knowing. Officer Hayes stood just behind them, his posture no longer rigid, his shoulders slightly lowered, his presence quieter than it had been when he first arrived. He watched the man and the dog not with suspicion, but with a kind of careful attention, the kind given to something that cannot be explained, only witnessed. "What is it?" one of the officers asked softly from behind him, the question carrying no urgency, only curiosity. Hayes did not answer right away. His eyes remained fixed on the small, partially revealed object, its surface still touched by traces of soil, its shape beginning to emerge more clearly now that the moment had slowed enough to allow it. William shifted slightly, his hand lifting just enough to brush away the last thin layer of dirt, revealing a worn metal tag attached to a collar that had long since faded with time. The leather was cracked, its edges softened by years beneath the earth, but the form remained intact, preserved not by condition, but by meaning. Rex's nose moved closer, hovering just above the collar, drawing in the scent with a quiet intensity, his breathing steady, his posture respectful, as if he understood that this was not something to be disturbed, but something to be honored. William's fingers traced the edge of the tag, his touch light, reverent, as if reading something written not in letters, but in memory. "He stayed where I left him," William said quietly, his voice carrying both relief and something deeper, something that sounded like peace. Hayes stepped closer, just enough to see the tag more clearly, the engraved letters faint, but still visible beneath the wear of time. He did not read them aloud. It did not feel like his place. Instead, he let the silence hold the meaning, trusting that what mattered was already understood by the one who needed to understand it most. Rex let out a soft breath, his body lowering even further until his chest rested against the ground, his head gently settling beside the collar, his presence no longer that of a working dog, but of something else entirely, something older, something rooted in instinct and recognition that went beyond training. William watched him, his expression softening in a way that made the years seem lighter, if only for a moment. "You found him," he said quietly, his voice directed not at the officers, but at Rex. The dog's ear flicked slightly at the sound, his tail moving once, slow and steady, as if acknowledging the words in a way that did not require response. Hayes felt a quiet shift settle deeper within him. Something that had begun as confusion now forming into understanding. Not complete, not defined, but real. He glanced at the other officers, seeing in their faces the same change, the same recognition that what they had stepped into was not a situation to control, but a moment to respect. "Sir," Hayes said gently, his voice careful, "we did not know." William nodded once, not in dismissal, but in acceptance. "You were not supposed to," he replied. The answer carried no resentment, only a simple truth, the kind that does not ask for apology because it does not assign blame. The wind moved again, a little stronger now, lifting a few loose strands of William's gray hair, carrying the scent of earth and time across the yard. Somewhere, a door closed softly, the sound distant but grounding, a reminder that the world beyond this moment still existed, even as this one continued to unfold. Rex shifted slightly, his head lifting just enough to look at William, his eyes calm, steady, holding a quiet question that did not need words. William met his gaze, his hand moving once more to rest against the dog's neck, his fingers settling into the fur with a familiarity that spoke of something long practiced, long remembered. "He would have liked you," William said softly. Rex's tail moved again, a small, deliberate motion, as if the idea had been received and accepted without hesitation. Hayes watched the exchange, his mind tracing the path that had brought them here, from a call of concern to a moment of quiet recognition, guided not by force, but by something far more precise. He glanced once more at the collar, then at the man, then at the dog who had refused to act when commanded, only to act when it mattered most. "He knew before we did," Hayes said quietly. William nodded, his eyes still on Rex. "They usually do," he replied. The words settled gently into the space around them, not as a conclusion, but as a truth that did not need to be proven. And in that stillness, with the past finally uncovered and the present quietly aligned around it, the moment held, not in tension, but in understanding, as if everything that had happened was not leading to something new, but returning to something that had always been there, waiting for the right eyes to see it. Time did not rush forward after that moment. It seemed to widen instead, stretching gently to hold everything that had surfaced. The collar rested in William Carter's hands now, no longer hidden beneath soil, no longer just a memory carried in silence, but something real again, something that could be seen, touched, and understood. His fingers moved slowly along the worn leather, tracing every crack and softened edge, as if reading a story written not in words, but in years. Rex remained close, his body pressed lightly against William's side, his presence steady, grounded, as if he had taken on a role that required no instruction. Officer Hayes shifted his weight slightly, the movement small but intentional, as he lowered himself just enough to be closer to eye level, no longer standing above the moment, but beside it. The other officers followed in their own quiet ways, some stepping back to give space, others simply lowering their stance, their earlier urgency replaced by something softer, something that did not need to be spoken. "You said his name was Eli," Hayes said gently, his voice careful not to disturb the quiet that had settled over the yard. William nodded, his gaze still on the collar. "He was more than a partner," he said. "He was the one who stayed when everything else fell apart." The words carried a weight that did not need elaboration, and yet the silence invited it, not out of curiosity, but out of respect. Hayes did not interrupt. He simply waited. The wind moved again, brushing through the trees, carrying a faint whisper of sound that seemed almost like an echo of something long past. William's eyes lifted slightly, not to the officers, but to the space just beyond them, as if the story he was about to tell did not belong to the present alone. "There are moments," William said slowly, "when everything becomes unclear. The ground shifts. The plan disappears. And all you have left is what stands beside you." Rex's ear flicked at the tone, his head lifting slightly, his eyes focused not on the words, but on the feeling behind them. "He never hesitated," William continued. "Not once. Even when I did." Hayes felt something tighten in his chest again, not from tension, but from recognition, the kind that comes when a truth reveals itself in a way that cannot be ignored. He glanced briefly at Rex, seeing now not just a trained canine, but something else, something that carried the same quiet certainty William described. "And you brought him back here," Hayes said softly. William nodded. "This was the only place that felt like it belonged to both of us," he said. "A place where the noise does not reach, where memory can settle without being pulled apart." The words settled over the yard, reshaping it, turning an ordinary patch of ground into something more, something that held meaning beyond what could be seen. Rex shifted slightly, his nose brushing once more against the collar, his breathing steady, his presence unwavering. It was not curiosity that guided him now. It was connection. Hayes noticed it again, the way the dog moved, the way he stayed, the way he chose stillness over action. He knew, Hayes said quietly, more to himself than to William. "Before any of us." William's gaze moved to Rex, his expression softening. "He did not know the way we think of knowing," he said. "He felt it. And sometimes that is clearer." Hayes let the words settle, turning them over in his mind, recognizing something in them that extended beyond the moment, beyond the call, beyond even the story unfolding in front of him. One of the officers behind him shifted slightly, his voice low but steady. "Sir," he said to Hayes, "what do we report?" The question lingered, practical and necessary, yet somehow distant from what mattered most in that moment. Hayes did not answer immediately. He looked at William, then at Rex, then at the collar resting in the old man's hands, and for the first time since the morning began, he understood that not everything needed to be reduced to a report. Some things needed to be remembered differently. "We report that everything is under control," Hayes said finally, his voice calm, certain in a new way. The officer nodded, stepping back slightly, the radio at his shoulder crackling again as he relayed the message. But the words felt smaller than the truth they were meant to contain. William let out a slow breath, his shoulders easing, not because the situation had ended, but because something within it had been resolved. He looked down at the collar once more, then at Rex, his hand resting gently against the dog's neck. "You brought him back to me," he said quietly. Rex's tail moved once, slow and deliberate, his eyes steady, as if the acknowledgement was understood without needing a response. Hayes watched the exchange, feeling the last remnants of his earlier certainty dissolve into something more open, more human. He took a step back, giving them space, not because he had to, but because it felt right. The yard no longer felt like a place of tension. It felt like a place of return. And in that quiet space, with the past uncovered and the present reshaped by it, something else settled into place, something that did not need to be spoken, only recognized. That sometimes, the ones trained to follow orders are the first to understand when it is time to listen to something deeper. And sometimes, the truth does not arrive through force or instruction, but through a quiet moment when instinct chooses compassion over command. The moment did not end when the officer stepped back or when the radio call was made. It settled into something quieter, something that lingered in the space between action and understanding. William Carter remained where he was, the collar resting in his hands, its worn edges catching the soft light of the morning as if time itself had chosen to pause long enough for it to be seen again. Rex stayed beside him, his body relaxed but attentive, his presence no longer defined by training or command, but by something deeper that had quietly taken root the moment he refused to move forward earlier. Officer Hayes watched them both, his mind no longer searching for answers in the way he had been trained to, but allowing the moment to shape its own meaning. There was a stillness now that felt different from before, not fragile, but complete in a way that did not demand resolution. The other officers began to move with more intention, not away from the scene, but around it, creating a respectful distance that allowed the space to remain undisturbed. One of them adjusted the position of a patrol car, another spoke quietly into his radio, but even those sounds felt softened, as if the morning itself had decided to lower its voice. William shifted slightly, the collar still held gently between his hands, his fingers tracing its surface one more time before he looked down at the place it had come from. The earth remained open, the dark soil contrasting against the lighter ground around it, a quiet reminder of what had been hidden and what had now returned. He reached for the shovel again, but this time his movement carried a different intention, not to uncover, but to restore. Rex noticed the shift immediately, his head lifting slightly, his eyes following William's hands with the same quiet focus he had shown from the beginning. There was no tension in him now, no uncertainty, only a calm awareness that the moment was changing once again. Hayes stepped a little closer, careful not to interrupt, his voice low when he spoke. "Are you going to put it back?" he asked. William nodded, his expression steady. "Not the way it was," he said. "The way it should be." The distinction settled into the air with quiet clarity. Hayes did not question it. He understood, not fully, but enough to know that the act itself mattered more than the explanation. William leaned forward, placing the collar gently at the base of the small opening, not burying it completely, but positioning it with care, as if it needed to remain part of both the earth and the world above it. His hands moved slowly, guiding the soil back into place, each motion deliberate, respectful, not erasing what had been revealed, but honoring it in a new way. Rex shifted closer, his body angled toward the spot, his nose hovering just above the ground as William worked. When the first layer of soil covered the collar, Rex lowered his head, resting it lightly against the earth, his eyes soft, his breathing steady. It was not a gesture of loss. It was a gesture of presence. Hayes felt something settle deeper within him as he watched, a quiet understanding that this was not an ending, but a continuation, a way of carrying something forward without needing to hold it in the same form. The wind moved again, lifting a few loose leaves and carrying them gently across the yard, where they settled near the freshly turned soil as if guided there. William paused for a moment, his hands resting against the ground, his eyes closed briefly as if offering something unspoken, something that did not need to be heard to be understood. Then he opened them and looked at Rex, his hand moving once more to rest against the dog's neck. "He is where he belongs," William said softly. Rex's tail moved once, slow and certain, his eyes meeting William's with a quiet acknowledgement that needed no translation. Hayes exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him with a sense of clarity he had not expected when the call first came through. He glanced at the other officers, seeing in their faces the same shift, the same quiet recognition that something meaningful had taken place, even if it did not fit into the structure of a report. One of them approached cautiously, his voice low. "Everything all right, sir?" he asked, not to Hayes this time, but to William. William looked up, his expression calm, grounded in a way that seemed to anchor the entire scene. "It is now," he replied. The officer nodded, stepping back again, the question answered in a way that required no further clarification. Hayes took one final look at the small patch of earth, now smoothed over but still distinct, a quiet marker of something that had been returned rather than taken. Then he looked at Rex, the dog who had changed the course of everything without a single act of force, simply by choosing to listen to something deeper than command. "He made the right call," Hayes said quietly. William's gaze followed his, resting on Rex with a faint, knowing expression. "He always would," he said. The words settled into the morning air, not as a conclusion, but as a truth that would remain long after the patrol cars left and the street returned to its ordinary rhythm. And as Hayes turned to give the signal to clear the scene, he understood something that no training had ever taught him, that sometimes the clearest sense of direction does not come from orders or protocol, but from the quiet instinct to recognize what matters, even when no one else sees it yet. The departure did not feel like an ending. It felt like a quiet agreement between those who had witnessed something they could not fully explain but would not forget. Patrol car doors closed with softer sounds than before. Engines started with a low hum that no longer carried urgency, and one by one, the vehicles eased away from the curb, their flashing lights dimming as they turned the corner and disappeared from view. Officer Hayes lingered a moment longer than the others, his hand resting lightly on the top of the open car door, his gaze still fixed on William Carter and the small patch of earth that now held a different kind of presence. Rex remained seated beside William, his posture relaxed, his ears occasionally flicking at distant sounds, but his attention never straying far from the man beside him. The street began to return to its ordinary rhythm, curtains slowly shifting back into place, a front door opening briefly across the way, the quiet curiosity of neighbors settling into something less tense, more reflective. Hayes finally closed the door, the sound firm but not abrupt, and stepped forward one last time. "Mr. Carter," he said, his voice steady, carrying none of the sharpness it had held earlier that morning. William looked up, his expression calm, grounded, as if the weight he had carried had shifted into something lighter, something that no longer needed to be held alone. Yes, he replied. Hayes paused, as if choosing his words carefully, not out of uncertainty, but out of respect for what had unfolded. If you ever need anything, he said, we are not just here for calls like this. The statement hung in the air, simple, but meaningful in a way that extended beyond duty. William gave a small nod, the gesture quiet but sincere. I know, he said. Rex glanced briefly toward Hayes, his eyes steady, acknowledging the presence without tension, without resistance. It was the same look he had given earlier, the one that seemed to see more than what was visible. Hayes held that gaze for a brief moment, then allowed a faint, almost imperceptible smile to settle at the edge of his expression before he stepped back and turned toward his vehicle. As he drove away, the street seemed to close gently behind him, the scene folding back into the quiet pattern of everyday life, yet carrying something new beneath the surface, something that would remain long after the memory of the call itself had faded. William stood slowly, his movements careful but steady, the years in his body no longer weighing as heavily as they had before. He brushed his hands lightly against his jacket, removing the last traces of soil, then looked down once more at the small patch of ground, now smoothed over, its presence marked not by anything visible, but by what it held. Rex rose beside him, his body aligning naturally with William's, his tail moving once in a slow, measured rhythm. The dog's eyes moved briefly across the yard, taking in the space, the house, the quiet street beyond, as if committing it all to memory in a way that required no effort. William rested his hand against Rex's neck, his fingers settling into the fur with a familiarity that had grown deeper in the span of a single morning. You did more than they asked of you, William said softly. Rex's ear flicked at the sound, his head tilting slightly, not in confusion, but in acknowledgement. The bond between them had shifted, not because it had changed, but because it had revealed itself more fully, like something that had always been there, waiting for the right moment to be seen. The wind moved again, carrying with it a gentler warmth now, the cool edge of the morning beginning to soften as the day unfolded. Somewhere in the distance, a car passed, its sound fading quickly, leaving behind the quiet that now felt less empty and more complete. William turned toward the house, taking a few slow steps along the walkway, Rex moving beside him without needing direction. At the edge of the porch, William paused, glancing back once more at the yard, at the place where the past had been uncovered and returned. There was no sadness in his expression, only a quiet sense of closure, the kind that does not erase what came before, but allows it to rest. Rex followed his gaze, his body still, his presence steady, as if standing watch over something that no longer needed protection, only remembrance. Some things do not leave us, William said quietly, more to himself than to the dog. They just wait for us to come back to them. Rex's tail moved once, slow and certain, the gesture carrying a quiet agreement that needed no words. William nodded slightly, as if the understanding had been shared, then turned and stepped onto the porch, the wooden boards creaking softly beneath his weight. The door opened with a familiar sound, the kind that belongs to a place that has been lived in, cared for, held onto. Rex followed him inside, pausing briefly at the threshold to look back one last time at the yard, at the place where something had been found not by searching, but by listening. Then he stepped forward, the door closing gently behind them, leaving the street in a quiet stillness that held the echo of what had happened, not as a disturbance, but as a reminder. And as the day moved on, unnoticed by most, that small patch of earth remained, not marked by stone or sign, but by something far more enduring, the kind of truth that does not need to be seen to be known, and the kind of loyalty that does not end, even when time tries to bury it. The house welcomed them back with a kind of quiet that felt different from the silence outside, softer, more familiar, like a place that had been waiting patiently for something to return. William Carter stepped inside slowly, the wooden floor beneath his boots giving a faint, steady creak that echoed gently through the room. Rex followed close behind, his paws making almost no sound at all, his presence as fluid as it had been in the yard, but now carrying a different kind of awareness, one that seemed to settle naturally into the space. The door closed behind them with a soft click, sealing out the last traces of flashing lights and distant engines, leaving only the stillness of a home that had just changed in a way no one else could see. William paused just inside the doorway, his hand resting lightly against the wall, as if grounding himself in something solid, something present. The air inside carried the faint scent of old wood and coffee, a quiet reminder of routine, of mornings that had come and gone without interruption. But today felt different. Not louder, not heavier, just clearer. Rex moved a few steps into the room, his nose lifting slightly as he took in the familiar surroundings. But there was something new in the way he did it, as if the house itself now held a story that he had become part of. He turned back toward William, his amber eyes steady, waiting without expectation. William exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him in a way that felt deeper than before, as if something he had been holding for years had finally found its place. He stepped forward, moving toward the small table near the window, the one that caught the morning light just right. The sunlight filtered through the glass in soft lines, settling across the surface, illuminating the faint scratches and worn edges that spoke of time and use. William rested his hand on the table, then pulled out a chair and sat down, the movement unhurried, deliberate. Rex settled beside him without needing direction, his body lowering onto the floor with a quiet ease, his head resting lightly against William's knee. The contact was simple, but it carried a weight that did not need explanation. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The house seemed to breathe around them, the faint ticking of an old clock somewhere in the next room marking the passage of time in a way that felt almost ceremonial. William reached up slowly, his hand moving toward a shelf mounted on the wall just above the table. There, among a few scattered items that had been left untouched for years, sat a small wooden box, its surface worn smooth by time, its edges softened by handling that had long since stopped. He hesitated for just a moment before lifting it down, the weight of it familiar in a way that went beyond the physical. Rex's ears flicked slightly at the movement, his eyes following the box with quiet attention, as if he understood that whatever was inside mattered in a way that could not be explained. William set the box gently on the table and opened it with care, the hinges giving a soft, almost hesitant sound. Inside, wrapped in a piece of faded cloth, were a few small items, each one carrying its own story, its own memory, its own place in a life that had once been shared. William unfolded the cloth slowly, revealing a photograph, edges worn, colors softened by time. He lifted it carefully, holding it in the light, his eyes tracing the image with a quiet intensity. It showed a younger version of himself, standing beside a German shepherd, both of them facing the camera, the dog alert, proud, the man steady, composed. There was no need to say the name. It was already there, in the way William's hand trembled just slightly as he held the photograph, in the way Rex lifted his head, his gaze fixed on the image as if something within it called to him. William smiled faintly, the expression small but genuine, a reflection of something that had not been lost, only set aside. "You never really leave," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Rex shifted closer, his nose lifting toward the photograph, his breath warm against the air, his presence steady. There was no confusion in him, no hesitation, only a quiet acceptance of something that did not need to be understood in the way humans understand things. William placed the photograph back into the box, folding the cloth gently around it, his movements careful, respectful, as if returning it to a place where it could rest, not hidden, but held. He closed the lid slowly, his hand resting on top of it for a moment longer than necessary. Rex leaned into him slightly, the contact grounding, real, present. William looked down at the dog, his expression softening once more, his hand moving to rest against Rex's neck, fingers settling into the fur with the same familiarity that had carried them through the morning. "You helped me find him," William said quietly. Rex's tail moved once, slow and certain, his eyes steady, reflecting a kind of understanding that did not rely on words. The house remained still around them, but it no longer felt empty. It felt complete. And in that quiet space, with the past acknowledged and the present held gently in place, something settled into William Carter's chest, not as an ending, but as a beginning that did not need to announce itself, because it had been there all along, waiting for the moment when it could finally be felt again. The quiet inside the house did not remain empty for long. It began to fill with something softer, something that moved not through sound but through presence. William Carter sat there for a while, his hand still resting lightly on the wooden box, his thumb tracing the edge without thinking, as if the motion itself had become a language his body understood better than words. Rex stayed close, his breathing steady, his head still resting against William's leg, but there was a shift in him now, something subtle but unmistakable, as if the dog had not only helped uncover the past, but had stepped into a place within it. The light through the window had changed slightly, warmer now, stretching further across the table, catching the edges of the box and casting a soft glow that made everything feel less like memory and more like continuation. William exhaled slowly, his shoulders easing in a way that did not come from rest, but from release. He lifted his hand from the box and placed it gently on Rex's head, his fingers moving slowly through the fur, not absent-mindedly, but with intention, as if each motion carried meaning. "You were not supposed to understand," he said quietly, his voice low and steady. "But somehow you did." Rex's ear flicked at the sound, his eyes lifting slightly, meeting William's with that same quiet focus that had guided him from the beginning. There was no question in his gaze, no uncertainty, only presence, as if the need to understand had never existed in the first place. William leaned back slightly in the chair, his eyes drifting toward the window, watching the way the light moved across the yard outside, across the place where something had been returned, not taken. For years, that patch of ground had held a silence he carried alone. Now it held something different. Not emptiness, not loss, something closer to peace. The clock in the next room ticked steadily, each second marking time in a way that no longer felt heavy. William listened to it for a moment, letting the rhythm settle into him, grounding him in the present without pulling him away from what had just been reclaimed. Rex shifted slightly, his body stretching out along the floor, his posture relaxed, but his attention never drifting far. He was not watching for danger. He was watching for meaning, in the quiet way only he seemed to know how. William reached for the box again, not to open it this time, but to move it. He lifted it carefully and placed it on the center of the table, where the light touched it fully, where it no longer sat in shadow or on the edge. It was a small gesture, almost invisible to anyone else, but it carried weight. It was no longer something kept aside. It belonged to the present now. Rex's gaze followed the movement, his head tilting slightly as if acknowledging the change. William noticed and allowed a faint smile to settle on his face, not forced, not fleeting, but real. "Things change when they are seen again," he said softly. "They do not disappear. They just take their place." The words lingered in the air, not needing response, not needing confirmation. The truth in them was quiet, but steady, like the ticking of the clock, like the light moving across the room, like the presence of the dog beside him. William pushed himself up slowly from the chair, his movements careful but firm, the years in his body still there, but no longer weighing him down in the same way. Rex rose with him, almost at the same moment, his body aligning naturally, as if they had done this 100 times before. William walked toward the window, stopping just short of it, his gaze moving out across the yard, to the place where the earth had been turned and returned. The soil had already begun to settle, the edges softening, blending back into the rest of the ground, but the place was still visible, still distinct, still carrying the quiet imprint of what it held. Rex stepped up beside him, his body close, his eyes following the same line of sight, his ears relaxed but attentive. They stood there together, not speaking, not needing to, the silence between them full, in a way that words could not have made it. After a moment, William reached down and rested his hand against Rex's shoulder, the contact steady, grounding, real. "You were not there," William said quietly, his voice thoughtful, not sad. "But somehow, you knew where to look." Rex's tail moved once, slow and certain, the gesture small but meaningful. William nodded slightly, as if the answer had been given, even without words. The light shifted again, moving further across the floor, touching the edges of the room, softening the corners, filling the space in a way that felt complete. William turned from the window, his posture straighter than it had been that morning, his steps measured but sure. Rex followed beside him, his presence no longer just that of a companion, but something more, something that had stepped into a place that had once been empty. William paused near the doorway, his hand resting briefly against the frame. Then he looked down at Rex, his expression calm, steady, and quietly grateful. "Some bonds do not end," he said. "They just find their way back." Rex looked up at him, his eyes clear, his presence unwavering, as if he understood that what had been found was not just something buried in the ground, but something that had always been waiting to be seen again. And in that quiet moment, standing between what had been and what was now, the house, the yard, and the two figures within it held a stillness that was no longer empty, but full, not of noise or movement, but of something far more lasting, something that did not need to be spoken to be true. The day moved forward without asking permission, the light outside shifting slowly across the yard, softening the edges of everything it touched, until even the place where the earth had been turned began to blend into the quiet rhythm of the ground again. Inside the house, William Carter stood for a long moment near the doorway, his hand resting against the frame as if feeling the structure beneath it, as if grounding himself in something steady after a morning that had changed more than he could yet put into words. Rex remained beside him, his presence calm, unwavering, his breathing slow and even, as if he had already settled into the shape of what came next. There was no urgency now, no sense of something unresolved, only a quiet continuation. William stepped forward, moving deeper into the house, his footsteps measured, not because he needed to be careful, but because the moment called for it. Rex followed without hesitation, his body aligned with William's in a way that no longer felt like training, but like understanding. They moved into the next room, where the light fell differently, softer, filtered through a curtain that had not been moved in some time. Dust particles drifted gently in the air, catching the light in small, floating patterns that seemed almost intentional, as if even the smallest things had decided to be seen. William paused near a shelf against the wall, his eyes moving across the objects resting there, each one a quiet marker of time, of years that had passed without interruption. His gaze settled briefly on an empty space, a place where something had once belonged but had not been replaced. He did not reach for it. He only noticed it, then let his eyes move on. Rex stepped closer, his shoulder brushing lightly against William's leg, the contact simple, grounding, enough to bring him fully back into the present. William looked down at him, a faint expression of recognition crossing his face, not surprise, but acknowledgement of something that had already taken root. "You stayed," William said quietly, his voice steady, not questioning, not expecting an answer. Rex's tail moved once, slow and certain, the gesture small but complete. William nodded slightly, as if that was all that needed to be said. He turned and moved toward the kitchen, the familiar space opening up in front of him, the counter worn smooth in places where his hands had rested countless times before. He reached for a kettle without thinking, filling it with water, setting it on the stove, the small, ordinary action carrying a kind of weight that felt different now. The sound of the burner igniting was soft, controlled, the flame steady as it took hold. Rex settled near the doorway, his body relaxed, his eyes half closed but still aware, still present. The house did not feel empty anymore. It felt inhabited in a way that went beyond presence, beyond sound. William leaned lightly against the counter, his gaze drifting toward the window above the sink, where the yard stretched out beyond, calm, unchanged on the surface, yet holding something new. Beneath it, he watched for a moment, not searching, not expecting, just seeing. The kettle began to hum softly, the sound building slowly, filling the space with a quiet energy that did not disrupt the stillness, but complemented it. William turned the flame down slightly, then reached for a cup, placing it on the counter with care. The small, simple rhythm of the movement felt grounding, like a return to something steady after something profound. Rex lifted his head slightly, his ears flicking at the sound, then settled again, his presence unchanged, consistent, as if he had always been there. William poured the water, the steam rising in thin, curling lines that caught the light before fading into the air. He held the cup for a moment, feeling the warmth through his hands, the sensation simple but real, anchoring him fully in the present. Then he took a slow sip, his eyes closing briefly as if acknowledging the moment in a way that did not require words. When he opened them again, he looked toward Rex, his expression calm, steady, and quietly certain. "We are not done," William said softly. "Not in the way I thought." Rex's eyes met his, clear and focused, his tail moving once in that same slow, deliberate rhythm. It was not agreement. It was understanding. William nodded again, setting the cup down gently, the sound barely audible. He stepped away from the counter, moving back toward the doorway that led to the yard, his steps measured but sure. Rex rose immediately, his body aligning once more beside him. Ready, present, not because he was told, but because he chose to be. William paused at the door, his hand resting briefly on the handle before he opened it, the light from outside spilling into the room, brighter now, fuller, carrying with it the quiet warmth of the day. He stepped out onto the porch, Rex following at his side, both of them moving toward the yard once more, not to uncover, not to search, but simply to stand where something had been returned. The small patch of earth lay still, undisturbed, its surface smooth, blending back into the ground around it, yet holding a presence that could not be seen, only felt. William stopped a few steps away, his gaze steady, his posture calm, his breath even. Rex stood beside him, his head slightly lowered, his body relaxed, his attention fixed not on anything visible, but on something deeper, something that had already been recognized. They stood there together in the quiet, the world moving gently around them, the wind brushing softly through the trees, the light settling across the ground, everything exactly as it should be. And in that stillness, with nothing left to uncover and nothing left to prove, something settled into place, not as an ending, but as a quiet truth that would remain long after the moment had passed. That sometimes, what we think we have lost is not gone at all. It is simply waiting for the right heart to return, and sometimes, it is a soul with no words that leads the way back.